Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. The world has changed a lot because of the coronavirus pandemic, in some ways quite drastically. And one area where this has occurred has been in education, with virtual classrooms taking the place of the real McCoy because 124,000 public and private schools across the United States have closed their doors. Furthermore, 43 states plus the District of Columbia have recommended that there be no coming back.
Ain't no coming back. There ain't no coming back.
At least not until the fall. But another change that has happened has been the rise in interest in homeschooling. As Breitbart reported back in March, because public schools have closed and because they were so ill-prepared to take their operation online, more and more parents have been giving homeschooling a second glance. And that second glance could very well become a serious relationship. Neil McCluskey, the director of the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom, has said that one of the long-term results of the pandemic might be, quote, people seeking more homeschooling that is separated from their public school. And so it could be the sort of disruption that introduces people to a way of receiving education that they hadn't really thought of before. They thought it was just too weird, and it may make it more mainstream. And this shift in public opinion might actually already be happening. Corey DeAngelis, also of the Cato Institute, tweeted back on April 23rd that a new national survey found that, because of the virus, more parents were more in favor of homeschooling. 52% of parents surveyed said that they were more favorable towards homeschooling now, and only 26% said that they were less favorable towards it. But of course, not everybody is happy with the shift. Kevin Huffman of the Washington Post and Jeff Bryant of Slate both wrote opinion pieces warning people that an increase in public schooling would be bad news for the country since, as the Post put it, it would set back an entire generation of children. And across the pond, the BBC ran a whole story saying just how impossible it is to homeschool an entire nation. Which is kind of funny, honestly, when you think about it, because we hear talk all the time about how climate change, or trans rights, are our civil rights moment, our World War II, and we're honestly admitting that we can't even educate our own kids? Yeah, utopia might be a little further away than people hoped. But the best reaction, hands down, and by that I mean the worst, came from the pages of the May-June issue of Harvard Magazine, where Aaron O'Donnell wrote at length of Elizabeth Bartholet, the Wasserstein Public Interest Professor of Law, and the faculty director of the Harvard Law School's Child's Advocacy Program. Bartholet painted a picture where homeschooling wasn't just detrimental to students' education, but was actually an authoritarian takeover of their lives, as well as a legitimate threat to U.S. democracy itself. And I ain't kidding, gang. I don't have the imagination it would take to come up with something like that. First, Bartholet says that homeschooling isolates children, making them more vulnerable to abuse. Because, as she puts it, teachers are the #1 group that will actually report abuse to Child Protective Services. And, as she is quick to point out, no state requires parents to be investigated for prior abuse before they can start homeschooling their own children. I'd like to ask Professor Bartholet if homeschooling is as threatening to children as the massive child abuse that is taking place right now in the public education system. According to a 2017 report published by the Center for Child Psychiatry and Psychology, 7% of children between the 8th and 11th grades were sexually abused by teachers and coaches. That comes out to 3.5 million children. When other examples of misconduct are included, being shown porn, sexually explicit language, even exhibitionism, that number jumps up to 4.5 million, a full 10% of children in the public education system who have been and who are being abused. Even worse, there is very little movement in the public education system to actually do anything to stop this evil. In 2018, the Chicago Tribune published a shockwave detailing how 72 Chicago public school employees, teachers, coaches, administrators, security guards, had abused kids in the system for decades. Now, the $64 question, of course, is why did it take until 2018 for this abuse to finally be uncovered? Well, there were a couple of reasons. First, ineffective background checks exposed children to educators with prior criminal records. Second, the Chicago public school system, by its own admittance, gang, remember that, by its own admittance, does not track child abuse by its employees in any consistent manner. It was only by double-checking police records that the Tribune was able to find that from 2008 to 2018, there were 523 reports of child abuse in the Chicago public school system, which averages out to 1 instance of sexual abuse every week. Another problem, not specifically restricted to the Windy City, is the teachers' unions. Investor's Business Daily, back in 2014, opined that teachers' unions really don't do everything that they can to protect kids because they really don't want the truth of this abuse scandal to get out. First, because it would complicate contract talks, and second, because it would taint the public's perception of teachers. Bartholet then pontificates that homeschooling actually represents a threat to U.S. democracy because, from the beginning of compulsory education in this country, we have thought of the government as having some right to educate children, so that they become active, productive participants in the larger society. But it's also important that children grow up exposed to community values, social values, democratic values, ideas about non-discrimination and tolerance of other people's viewpoints. You know what's also a threat to U.S. democracy? An uneducated populace. Go through the writings of the Founding Fathers and you will quickly find that one common thread among all of them was the idea that education wasn't just nice, but was actually essential for a self-governing republic to actually work. Thus, John Adams, in his essay Thoughts on Government, said, quote, "Laws for a liberal education of youth, especially of the lower class of people, are so extremely wise and useful that to a humane and generous mind, no expense for this purpose should be thought extravagant." In the same vein, Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." George Washington, in his first inaugural address, opined, quote, "Knowledge is, in every country, the surest basis of public happiness." I could keep going with this, but I'm sure that you guys get the picture. And what is the American education system failing at today? If you guessed educating our students, you are a winner!
You just won the solid gold Cupid doll.
According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, i.e. the nation's report card, only 41% of 4th graders and only 34% of 8th graders were proficient in math in 2019. That same year, only 35% of 4th graders and 34% of 8th graders were proficient in reading. The numbers for writing were even worse, 28 and 27% respectively. And history? Forget about it. In a story published in The Hill back in 2018, only 1 out of 3 American students can pass the 20 multiple-choice history questions on the U.S. citizenship exam. Well, maybe that's not so bad. I mean, those questions have got to be really, really tough, right? Oh, God. What that number means is only 13% of American students know what year the U.S. Constitution was ratified. 60% don't know which countries the U.S. was fighting in World War II. And worst of all, less than 25% of American students know the reasons why the American colonists rebelled against the British and fought the Revolution. Think about that again for just 1 second. More than 75% of the country doesn't even know why we became our own country to begin with. But instead of teaching reading, writing, math, science, history, schools today are more intent on teaching, well...
Anyway, how is your sex life?
In California now, 5th grade teachers must accept and recognize different sexual orientations. They must also be quote-unquote inclusive towards same-sex arrangements, gender identities, and gender expressions. They must also tell their students about the harm done by negative gender stereotypes. And sometimes, it gets worse. One parent, a father by the name of John Andrews, who lives in the Murrieta School District, told the Daily Signal that his school district was using a book called Positive Prevention Plus Sex Ed, a book that is chock full of explicit pics and photographs. Oh, and as a bonus, this book also teaches grade school kids about oral and anal sex as alternatives to the real thing because those things don't lead to pregnancy. In a similar vein, the Austin School District was caught red-handed passing out information to its students about how to use a condom as well as how to perform anal sex. Is it really any mystery why 30% of high school students, including 46%, almost half of high school seniors, say that they are sexually active? And when schools aren't teaching their students about sex, they are not so much educating them as programming them for a specific ideological worldview. Thus, regardless of the flaws and problems that it has, flaws and problems that have been pointed out multiple times by experts, schools are still teaching the New York Times' 1619 Project as if it were gospel. Even though the project leader, Nicole Hannah-Jones, was forced to make a correction in her inaugural essay, whereas before she wrote that slavery was one of the major reasons why the colonists rebelled against England, the corrected version now says that slavery was a major reason why some of the colonists rebelled. That's a pretty big correction, honestly. But, in the words of a famous pirate, all of this pales into utter insignificance in light of Bartholet's grand slam. She says, quote, "Do we think that parents should have 24/7, essentially authoritarian control over their children from ages 0 to 18? I think that's dangerous. I think it's always dangerous to put powerful people in charge of the powerless and to give the powerful ones total authority." What compounds this danger in her eyes is the fact that 90% of parents who homeschool do so because of their conservative and or Christian beliefs. What makes this argument, this position, so insidious isn't just the bigotry behind it. Conservative Christian beliefs equals authoritarianism equals a denial of science and the promotion of white supremacy. It's the seismic shift that this argument implies. We've talked before here on the channel how the family, dad, mom, the kids, maybe grandparents too, is the cornerstone not just of society but of civilization. Aristotle was the first one to really articulate this point in his Politics, but this idea goes way beyond Aristotle. Going backwards, Plato had a similar idea in his Republic, and going even further back to the very beginning of recorded history in ancient Egypt, every city and village in ancient Egypt didn't just have its own local deity, it had a triad of deities: father, mother, child. Amun, Mut, and Khonsu in Thebes, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Abydos, Ptah, Sekhmet, and Nefertum in Memphis. Egyptian wisdom literature encouraged young men to marry young because it is good to make children. Now going in the opposite direction, past Aristotle, we have the Roman senator, Marcus Cicero, who said, quote, "The first bond of society is the marriage tie, the next are children, then the whole family of our house, and all things in common." Past the Romans in Germania, the German idea of freedom, Freya, was tightly intertwined with ideas of obligation and duties, both towards one's family and to one's tribe, one's extended family. Now, an obvious question is, why is this? Why has the historical norm across space and time been to recognize that the family is the linchpin of civilizations? Well, it has to do with sex. The sexual revolution of the 60s and the 70s, and which honestly continues to roll along today, has actually blinded us to what sex is actually all about. In the words of Dr. Margaret Paul, today, sex means different things to different people. But while sex may be used differently by different people, and while sex may be given different subjective meanings by different people, at the end of the day, when all is said and done, sex is about children. Sex and children just go together like bacon and eggs, Roger and Hammerstein, Superman and the American flag. No, every time a man and a woman get together, a baby isn't going to pop out. But every time that a baby does pop out, we can be pretty sure that sex has happened sometime in the past. Risible position today, you say? Well, maybe. But think about it like this. If sex and children were not intimately connected, there really would be no reason to practice safe sex. Now, because sex and children are intimately connected, and because children are their own person, with their own stories and destinies, their own bodies, souls, willpower, and agencies, this means that sex is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. But not in the way that the feminists and the intersectionalists are always yammering on about hierarchies and how women and minorities are continually oppressed by the white, straight male syndicate. Sex is power like fire is power, water is power. We still need and use fire to cook our food, to forge our steel, and to power our engines. We still use water to produce electricity. But they only can do this when they are contained. Only when fire is in the oven or in the forge or in the engine is it actually a good thing. Only when water is confined behind the hydroelectric dam is it a good power. When they are allowed just to run wild, whether in a forest fire or in a flood, then all that they cause is destruction. We've seen footage of natural disasters. We know the death and damage that this unleashed power can actually wreak upon us. Now think about the power that creates new human life. And think about what that power could do if it was just allowed to run wild across the world. And that is actually why we have marriage. Marriage is the fire pit into which the fire of creation can burn, and burn safely, so that sex becomes a positive good, good with a capital G, for men, women, and civilization. And the family is the forge for the fire of creation, not just because that's how babies are supposed to come about, or because that's how civilization perpetuates itself. Civilization kind of comes to a dead end if there aren't new people to actually continue it after all. But because it is in that forge, father, mother, and children, that love is expanded and taught. Love of one another, love of country, love primarily of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And if the family has done its job, then with love implanted firmly in their hearts, children, the next generation, can go out and actually not only be good citizens, but be good people, worthy possessors and builders, continuers of civilization. Having said all that, we can now see the seismic shift that Bartholet's argument creates. By describing the family as authoritarian and implying that it is nothing more than a breeder for incorrect ideas, here conservatism and Christianity, Bartholet shifts the focus from the family to the state. In Bartholet's mind, the family is not the heart of civilization, the state is. And it's not even an idea of the state that might have been held by the ancient Spartans or even some of the ancient Romans. That actually, for however flawed and shallow it might be, would actually be something real and tangible. Instead, in Bartholet's mind, the state is nothing more than the bureaucratic apparatus that exists to perpetuate itself and its own ideology and fads. And it is in that apparatus that she wants to put the fire of creation. But here's the kicker, of course. The apparatus can't create us. The state and its bureaucratic system only exist because families created people. People and families don't exist because the apparatus deemed that families were a necessary part of the plan. Furthermore, the state is powerless to give us the love that we need and the love that we crave and the love that we receive from our parents and from our family. How could it? It is a bloated, impersonal, and more these days, unjust system that exists solely to perpetuate itself, its own ends, and its own ideas. We, are simply drones for it to use to further those ends. Hell, how could it do these things? How could it love us, let alone create us, when it can't even educate us? But of course, what the state can and can't do isn't the real question here, or the real issue at hand, because when push comes to shove, we all know why ideologues are doing this. Ideologues will now be our fathers and our mothers, meaning that their power base will be expanded 100-fold. That's the real reason for this, and that is Bartholet and Harvard's endgame, whether they want to admit it or not. But as always, what say you? Should we encourage more parents to actually homeschool their children, and should we work towards realigning society so that more parents can actually do that if they so choose? As always, let me know your thoughts, ideas, and opinions in the comment box below. Well, that about wraps up everything for right now, gang. As always, if you liked the video, whether you agreed with me or not, don't forget to show your support by giving it a like and sharing it with your friends on social media. And if you like videos that deal with culture, politics, and religion from a unique POV, then don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell for notifications. As always, thank you for watching and for giving me a little bit of your day. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed to my channel. And I will see you next week, gang, here on top of the stone. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and remember to dare to read, think, speak, and write. I'll see you soon. Ciao.